let's get back. We're halfway through the lesson, and how did we get our gospel? What route did the Lord take it through to bring it to us? And we left off with the statement that Israel itself was about to be provoked unto jealousy by God and through God's agents. We had seen how many ways and how many times, well, not all the times, but we saw some of the times that Israel had provoked God by going after other gods, going after the Queen of Heaven, and all these things. But let's start by looking in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 20 and 21. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be. For they are a very froward generation, children in whom is no faith. They have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities. And I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Now, in that verse there, God could have just said, I will move them to jealousy. I will provoke them to anger. But God had important, not to be ignored information that He preserved for us in these verses. So He had Moses to write, I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Now, those are mentioning agents by which God will accomplish this provoking. We want to compare God's agents listed here in Deuteronomy 32:21 with God's agents listed in Romans 10:19. See what we find. Romans 10:19 says, But I say, did not Israel know? First Moses saith, I will provoke you to jealousy by them which are no people, and by a foolish nation I will anger you. Well, God said through Moses that He will provoke Israel to jealousy with those which are not a people. That was in Deuteronomy 32:21. And in Romans 10:19 He said, by them that are no people. So that's the same group of people, not a people and no people. Well, God said through Moses that He will provoke Israel to anger with a foolish nation in Deuteronomy 32:21, but in Romans 10:19, and by a foolish nation I will anger you. So you see that it's the same group of people told about in Deuteronomy 32:21 as in Romans 10:19, and also in Romans 11:11. As far as the Jews, the foolish nation part. Well, let me take that part back. Let's just read the verse. Romans 11:11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. They didn't. When they stumbled, they didn't have to go on and fall. They stumbled at the cross, the stumbling block. But they didn't have to fall after that, fall out of God's favor as God's precious. I'm trying to think of the wording there in Exodus 19:5. Precious treasure, I think it is. They did not have to fall. But it goes on to say, but rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. Excuse me just a moment here. Got a little hoarse throat today. All right, we're continuing on with part 2, and we saw the connection between God's agents to provoke Israel in Deuteronomy 32:21, and that they were the same people as God's agents to provoke Israel in Romans 10:19, talking about the same two groups of people. And so in Romans 11:11 we see it says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. So we can see here again two groups. They appear again here in Romans, well, one of the two at least, in Romans 11:11. There's an additional description, though, of those which are not a people. In this verse, they're called the Gentiles. Well, again, which Gentiles is it talking about? That is the Gentiles that the same verse and other verses say were in a position to provoke Israel to jealousy. Through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Those Gentiles could only be the Greeks in the Jewish synagogues, Sabbath after Sabbath. Not all the Gentiles. It doesn't say all the Gentiles. It's those specific Gentiles that were in the synagogues, called Greeks, because that's what they were called. They blessed Israel and feared God. Most Gentiles didn't. Most of them were alien from Israel, foreigners. Didn't know anything about God or God's people. But this says, unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them, being Israel, to jealousy. To provoke Israel to jealousy. It was those of the non-Jews who were not a people. Israel was a people. Ephesus was a people. Egypt was a people. Syrophoenicia was a people. But the biblical Greeks were not a people, not a nationality. The Greeks were seekers of wisdom and knowledge. They had been influenced by the high value that the former Greek Empire placed on wisdom and knowledge. The Greeks were the intellectuals of the day, no matter what their nationality was. Mostly in the Bible, they were seekers of wisdom and knowledge of God. And when they found the wisdom and knowledge of God in the synagogue scriptures, they blessed Israel as they found pleased God. In Genesis 12, verse 3, it pleased God when people that were not Jews would bless Israel or bless a Jew. And God, in his covenant with Israel, covenanted that he would bless outsiders, bless Gentiles that would bless Israel. They could expect a blessing from God. Now the covenant wasn't with the Gentiles, it was with Israel only, but the benefit came to the Gentiles that would bless Israel and fear God. But that's just what the Syrophoenician national did, who the Bible called a Greek in Mark 7:26. And that did not limit to whom Paul could go and to preach the gospel of salvation. But it did limit to whom Christ sent Paul and charged him with the responsibility of preaching the gospel of God and the gospel of Christ. After Christ, surprisingly, rescued Saul of Tarsus from his condition, condemned as unforgivable, Paul had every right to say in parts of 1 Corinthians 9, verses 16 to 18, I've pulled out some of his statements here. He had every right to say, necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. A dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. I may make the gospel of Christ without charge. So, he was apprehended, but he would have been condemned. He was standing as a condemned person when the Lord appeared to him on the road to Damascus. The Lord rescued him, saved him. And he was saved as a sinner. Let's consider this complex wording in this sending here in Acts 26 verse 17. Somewhat complex. Acts 26:17, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles unto whom now I send thee. Now, there's a whole context around this, and it goes from one part of the story to the next. He's getting put on trial then. And so, but this is the part that states all the facts right here. We've checked the context. In Acts 26:17, on the road to Damascus, at the time when Christ saved unforgivable Saul of Tarsus, he sent him to those same two groups of people from whom he would deliver him. From the people, that's the Jews, and from the Gentiles. That can't mean all the Jews and all the Gentiles, or that would mean that Paul needed to be delivered from everyone in the world, including his fellow workers. The context does not confirm that reading, does not support that. So there was an element of the Jews from whom Paul needed to be delivered. And there was an element of the Gentiles from whom Paul needed to be delivered. Those are the same people, same the people, and the same the Gentiles that we identified earlier in Deuteronomy 32, verse 21, and in Romans 10, verse 19, and 11:11. They're the same the people and the same the Gentiles that are in a position to provoke Israel to jealousy and to anger. In Romans 10:19. They're the same the people and the same the Gentiles from which Paul will need to be delivered. And they're the same the people and the same the Gentiles to whom Christ sent Paul to preach the name of Jesus, the identity of Jesus, that Paul was separated unto in Romans 1:1. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. And he goes on to give the three facts that are included in the gospel of God. The sonship of Jesus, the messiahship of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. Well then, how did we get our gospel of the grace of God preached to us? We haven't been in the synagogues to bless Israel before Israel was cast away in Acts 28:28. Acts 28:28 reads, Be it known therefore unto you that the salvation of God is sent unto the Gentiles, and that they will hear it. Well, what was the route that God sent our gospel on to get it to us? The preceding events and scriptures lead us to the point of answering that question. Philippians 4:15 answers the question of how all the Gentiles got our gospel of the grace of God by telling us that the beginning of the gospel was when Paul departed from Macedonia. Philippians 4:15. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but you only. Well, that's an important fact, that the beginning of the gospel was when Paul departed from Macedonia. Acts 16:12 tells us that Philippi was the chief city of that part of Macedonia. So it's no small town. Acts 20 verse 6 tells us that Paul departed from Macedonia when he sailed away from Philippi, Macedonia, being sent far hence unto the Gentiles, Acts 22:21. And he was sent far hence to the Gentiles to dispense or to testify the gospel of the grace of God. Acts 20, verse 24. That was years after Christ sent Paul to the Jew first and also to the Greek, who were in a position to provoke Israel to jealousy and save some. Later, during the dispensation of the grace of God, Paul wrote to those in Philippi who had been saved by the gospel of Christ during a dispensation of the gospel before Paul was sent to all men. In that being in Acts 20 verse 6, but the reference to the gospel of Christ in the prison epistle, the only reference to it is this one here in Philippians 1:27, where he's talking about people that had been saved in Acts 16 back in the dispensation of the gospel. And then after he wrote Philippians, Paul wrote, at least this is the way I take the order to be, understand it to be, Paul wrote to Timothy and to Titus about Jerusalem relief that started in the Acts period dispensation of the gospel. And you can see about that in Philippians 1 verse 1, 1 Timothy 3 verses 1 to 7 and 15, 1 Timothy 5, verses 17 to 19, and Titus 5 to 9, verses 5 to 9. Well, after those two middle, so to speak, epistles, Paul wrote more post-Acts epistles of Colossians and Philemon, which would make those Timothy and Titus be more toward the beginning, right after Philippians, actually, toward the beginning of his post-Acts, or so-called prison epistles. Lastly, Paul wrote two final epistles. He wrote to the Ephesians that he had not known about before that, and then he wrote the second epistle to Timothy, which completed our Bible. And I'm done with that study, so I hope it was informative and helpful and edifying with the scriptures in it. If you want to see it or hear it, the scriptures, I put a lot of verses that confirm and verify what I'm saying, but I didn't read all the verses, so if you want more proof, just look up all those verses that I just gave a reference to instead of reading.